everybody. How you doing today? Good to have you here. Just like Vanessa said, we are finishing up this mental health series called White Flag, and today we are talking about trauma. And I'm not going to waste any time. I'm just going to get right into it. Got quite a bit to chat through. My 26 years of being in full-time ministry, I have sat in the midst of trauma for many people. Before we came here, we planted a church in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And one Saturday morning, I sat in this family's living room on the couch. A couple of hours earlier, they had just heard that their 21-year-old son, who was enlisted in the Navy, was stationed in Naples, Italy, had died tragically in a car accident as he was making his way back home after a long night shift. And I sat there in that room that day, and Mom was on the floor. She had all these photos around her of her son, tears just covering her face, and she just kept asking me the question, why? I watched as the dad of this son walked out onto the deck of their home, and it had furniture and a grill, and he just starts grabbing everything off of that porch, and he begins to sling it into his backyard, and he's yelling and screaming the loss of his child. I walked a path with a family who found out that one of their children was sexually abusing the other siblings in the home. I've walked through times where women have shared their experiences of being raped. Here at the Journey, I've had the opportunity to talk to a couple of people in the military who have talked about being in war and firefights and mortar attacks and watching friends be blown up by IEDs in the vehicles in front of them. I've worked with families who have gone through suicide of a parent, family member, friend. And for the past 26 years, I have been walking alongside my wife, Kara, who has had to deal with the abuse of a dad for 15 years as a child. Like these traumatic events and experiences, as we know, are life-threatening in some ways, life-changing, life-altering. And as we can imagine, when it comes to something like trauma, it brings with it so many mental health challenges. Now, therapists will tell you that what I've just described to you, and there are so many other things we could put there, they would describe this as big T trauma, right? These are big things that happen in our lives that cause incredible trauma. But there's also little T trauma. There are little things that can happen in our life that we don't think are that big of a deal, but over time we can experience the same thing that people who experience big T trauma experience in their own life. Things like the loss of a loved family pet, going through divorce, being fired, being bullied, an illness, relational conflict, a financial crisis. Again, the list could go on, and we don't think about those being that big, but those are traumas too that we experience. And over time, we can find that they can end up affecting us the same way that those big T traumas affect those of us that have experienced that in our lives. What we realize is that trauma is a wound, right? In fact, that's what the Greek word trauma is. It means wound. But here's the thing about this wound and that word. The very first part of that word, T-R-A-U, tra, that actually means to rub or to turn. And so if you think about trauma, and if you've experienced it before in your life, there is this wound that is deep inside of you, and it feels like maybe on a daily basis, something or someone is in there just turning that wound and making it worse and worse because that wound too often never goes away. And the results from those wounds that we've experienced are ongoing. They are long-lasting. They affect us physically, emotionally, mentally, relationally, and of course, they affect us spiritually too. But when we think about trauma and we kind of think about what we've talked about over the last few weeks in this series, in many ways, it could be easier to talk about our anxiety, right? Or depression, or going through grief. It feels like it's a little bit easier to share that. But when it comes to something like trauma, we don't share those stories. We keep those stories to ourselves. We don't seek the help that we need. We don't seek the healing that we need. We never take a step of getting professional help in the trauma that we have gone through. But the question is, why? Why are we afraid to do that? Why are we afraid to ask for help? Why are we afraid to seek healing? Well, the answer is we don't want to have to walk through those experiences again. Our fear is if I begin to walk down that path, I'm going to have to retell that story. These memories are going to come back in my life. And I just don't want to deal with that. I've compartmentalized that. I've disassociated from that. I've in some ways sort of hidden that or tried to forget that. But when we get to that place, we will never experience healing in our lives. And so my hope today is that we talk about this pretty tough subject of trauma, that we can take some steps of finding help, that we can take some steps of finding healing, but even bigger than that, that we can see that God is at work in your life. And we're going to do this by looking at a story that maybe you're familiar with. It comes out of Genesis chapter 16. It's about Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. We did a series on Abraham about 2 years ago. We looked at this particular story, but we looked at it in a different context that we're going to look at it today. But we find it again, Genesis chapter 16. Here's how the story begins. Look at verse 1. It says, now Sarai, Abram's wife, and let me just throw this out. Sarai becomes Sarah, Abram becomes Abraham, so the name's changed by God. So I'm going to probably say Sarah and Abraham throughout the time to get today. But had not been able to bear children for him. But she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, the Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her. And Abram agreed with Sarai's proposal. I shared this 2 years ago. I will share this every time I tell this story, dudes. If you were ever offered this plan, do not take it, okay? It's a trap. It's going to be bad. It's going to be terrible for everybody. If you know the story, you know it doesn't turn out well at all. But here's what is so powerful about this story and kind of strange about it too. Abraham has been handpicked by God. And God comes to Abraham and says, hey, here's these promises I'm going to make to you. And one of the promises he makes is that, Abraham, you're going to be the father of many nations. Problem is, Abraham's in his 80s. And he's in his 80s, and he and Sarah have 0 children. Well, Sarah jumps in, and Sarah's like, okay, well, here's the deal, Abraham. Doesn't seem like God's listening. It doesn't seem like God cares. Seems like God has forgotten us. So we're going to take matters into our own hands. And so she says, Abraham, take Hagar, my servant, have sexual relations with her, and then her child will become our child. I know that sounds weird for us in our culture today. Culturally, that was normal then. It was legally outlined that you could do this. And so in that kind of home, if the patriarch was given the maidservant and the maidservant becomes pregnant and has a child, then the patriarch and the matriarch, they actually take over, if, for lack of a better term, that child becomes their property, right? That becomes their kid. So we see all of this is happening here with Sarah and Abraham. But I want you to think about Hagar. She doesn't have very many rights, if any at all. And think about her life. She's away from home. She's far away from home. She's far away from her family. She is doing everything that she can do to just survive. And yet she finds herself in the middle of this mess. Verse 3. So Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian servant, and gave her to Abram as a wife. This happened 10 years after Abram had settled in the land of Canaan. So Abram had sexual relations with Hagar, and she became pregnant. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat his mistress Sarai with contempt. On the one hand, plan works, right? Hagar becomes pregnant. So now this means that Sarah and Abraham can have this child that can be theirs. But on the other hand, like I said earlier, if you get offered this plan, do not take it because it leads to trouble. And here we already see this trouble. What does Hagar realize? Hagar realizes she's pregnant. And then she looks at Sarah and she realizes Sarah is not pregnant, has never been pregnant, has never experienced pregnancy, has never had a child. And so Hagar begins to really take on this emotion of taunting and making fun of Sarah, maybe saying things like, hey, Abe and I, we got this connection. Look what we were able to do. You weren't able to do that, but we could do it, and I am making this child come to be. Or you know what? I'm pregnant, Sarah. I can't make dinner. I can't take care of the laundry. I can't clean like I'm supposed to. Can you do that? Because I'm pregnant, and I know you've never experienced that before, but maybe this is a good time for you to learn some of these things that I do. I mean, there's this tension that is there, right? There's this tension between Sarah and Hagar, which then leads to the tension between Sarah and Abraham. Verse 5. And Sarah, I said to Abram, this is all your fault. I put my servant into your arms, but now that she's pregnant, she treats me with contempt. The Lord will show who's wrong, you or me. Abram replied, look, she is your servant, so deal with her as you see fit. And then Sarai treated Hagar so harshly that she finally ran away. How does Sarah respond to all of this? She blames Abraham. She's like, Abraham, this is all your fault. And Abraham's probably like, well, hold up a second. This was your plan. You came up with this. No, this falls on you. Now, can we be honest? This is as much Abraham's fault as Sarah's. Abraham could have very easily said, no, I decline. Let's wait on God. God's got a plan. But Abraham is an idiot and does what he shouldn't have done. And so it brings this tension between him and Sarah. And so how does Abraham respond to Sarah? He says, hey, I'm not getting in the middle of this. This is between you and Hagar. You do whatever you want to do with her. And how does Sarah deal with Hagar? Go back to verse 6 there. Sarai treated Hagar so harshly that she finally ran away. That word that's used there, harshly, means to punish. It means to oppress, to humiliate, to exploit. In fact, we find that word used a little bit later on when it comes to how the Egyptians were treating the Hebrew slaves. And this word is also used to describe the act of rape. And we don't know exactly what Sarah does to Hagar, but what we can figure out is maybe she wears her down mentally, maybe she loads her up physically, maybe she guilts her emotionally. Whatever the case may have been, Sarah couldn't handle what she had helped make happen. Like she reaches her limits. These frustrations began to take over, and then she unleashes on Hagar. And so when we look at verse 6 there, and we see that Sarah treated her so harshly, and we know the meaning of this word, this really helps us to understand the intensity of what Sarah was doing to Hagar. But again, let's go back to Hagar. Where is she in all of this? Well, feels used. She's now pregnant. She's been abused. She is scared, and she runs away. And we find her alone and vulnerable. And some of you have been in the exact same place as Hagar. That for you, you probably have sat there in these traumatic experiences that you've had, and you said, no one knows what I'm going through. No one will understand what happened to me. No one cares about me. And so like Hagar, you have made a decision of how you would respond to that trauma. Now, I've shared some of these before. If you've been in therapy at all, especially if you've dealt with some sort of trauma, you're probably familiar. There's 4 F words. There's a couple more that they have added, but I'm going to share these 4 because these tend to be the most normal responses to trauma. The first one is flee. This is exactly what Hagar does, right? You try to run and escape that trauma. Panic sets in. Fears take over, our anxiety kicks in, and so we try to run and escape the trauma that we have experienced. And many times that could be a person or a place. For others of you, maybe you fight. You take on the conflict. You fight to control this experience, and it means you become an angry person, right? You're full of rage, you're frustrated, and it plays out in many different ways within your life, but you fight from what you've experienced. Others, you freeze. You become immobile, you shut down. You feel hopeless and trapped and numb, helpless. You isolate. You disassociate a lot from those experiences that you've had, but you freeze. And still others, you fawn. You please and appease. You are trying to do everything you can to neutralize the trauma you've experienced, which means you fail to set up boundaries. You fail to set up those boundaries, and it just becomes this continuous cycle over and over again. So for some, you fawn. If you've experienced trauma in your life, you probably have responded in one of these ways. And Hagar has chosen to deal with her trauma by running from it. But how does running from it affect her life? Well, I want to spend the next few moments, the rest of our time together really, looking at these 4 observations of the rest of the story here, and how we can not only find help and healing, but we can see God at work in what we've experienced. Here's the first thing I would say. God knows where you are. Look at verse 7. The angel of the Lord found Hagar beside a spring of water in the wilderness along the road to Shur. Hagar runs. She ends up in this remote place near this tiny village of Shur. But here's the interesting part. Shur means wall. So think about Hagar and where she is. She has hit a wall. She is lost. She is alone. She is tired. She is worn out in any way you can imagine. She is up against the wall. And if you've experienced trauma before, you have probably gotten to this place too. Like, what do I do now? Where do I go? How do I get out of this? And you know how we usually answer that question is we kind of do like Sarah and Abraham do it a little bit earlier. We take matters into our own hands. And so maybe we experience trauma in this neighborhood, so we're going to move to another neighborhood, or we're going to move to another state or to another country because I'm going to get away from what I have experienced in my life. I'm going to get a different job, or I'm going to jump into a new relationship. Or for some of us, you choose like these new ways to cope. And so you take on addictions to feel better, or to feel nothing. But what do we know about these traumatic experiences in our life? Where do they go? They don't stay in the place that we moved from or that we left, right? They're still with us. Those experiences never leave us. The issue is that we haven't looked for help in healing through what we have faced. And oftentimes when we don't take those steps, it brings on more and more mental health challenges. But look at what we see here in the story, that even though Hagar was running, God still knew where she was. There's 5 of us in our family, and on our phones we have something called Life 360. Maybe some of you got teenagers, you've got that on your phones too. And so we can track where our kids are at any time. And some of you are like, but there's privacy issues. There's no privacy issues in our house, all right? We pay for it. It's our phone. You want privacy? You take care of that yourself, okay? Even our married kid who lives down in North Carolina right now, she's on Life 360. And we told her, hey, you're married. You got a husband. He can help you out and take care of you if you need it, but you don't have to be on it. She's like, no, I want to be on it too. We're like, hey, that's wonderful for us. So we know where our kids are if we need to know where they are. Kara knows where I am. I know where Kara is. And can I be honest with you? There's something kind of comforting about that. And I think about that, and I think about God, and God's no different. That even though you may be fleeing or fighting or fawning or freezing, God knows exactly where you are. And for some of us, that may be the one thing that we need right now so that we can learn to deal with our trauma, knowing that God knows where we are. But it's not only that God knows where we are, God knows who you are. Look at verse 8 there. The angel said to her, Hagar, Sarai's servant, where have you come from and where are you going? I've mentioned this before. Many times when you find that term or that title, angel, in the Old Testament, it's actually referring to God. So when we see this here, that God finds Hagar in the desert, and God knows her by name. If we look at her name, Hagar means forsaken and flight. Think about that. She probably feels forsaken by Sarah and Abraham, by God. And yet, what do we find her doing? She's flighting, right? She is fleeing from everything she's experienced. So her name fits so perfectly. But here is God saying, hey, Hagar, I know you've been mistreated. I know you've been abused. I know you're running, but I know you. And I know who you are. A couple of weeks ago, I ran across this post on social media. I think it was kind of funny. A guy named Colin says, I have 3 dad friends at school drop-off. We fist bump and banter. I have no idea what their names are. My wife is shocked. It's a guy thing to be friends and not know their name, right? Is this true, guys? Yeah. We're like, hey, dude, hey, man, what's going on? That's all we need. We're good to go. And ladies like, what are you doing? You don't know their names? No, I don't need to. We're good. We can answer to that. Now, thankfully, God's not that way, okay? God knows who you are, and God knows your name. Isaiah 49:16, see, I have written your name on the palms of my hands. Before the invention of smartphones, when you needed to write down a date, a time, an address, get her or his number, you remember what we used to do? We used to look for a pen, right? We grabbed a pen, and then we opened up our palm, and you'd write that information down, or, maybe a girl or guy, like, hey, can you write it for me, so you kind of feel their hand against your hand, and they would write it in there, and then you had to remember not to wipe your brow or to wipe your pants leg or wash your hands. I mean, you would just walk around like this all day so that you wouldn't do that. So then finally you could write that down. Now some of you are like, what do you mean you had to write phone numbers down? You had to learn these back in the day, people, okay? And but it was because it was something important you wanted to remember. And guess what? You are important to God. And God knows who you are. God knows what you've been through. You are not forgotten. You are not faceless. You are not nameless. You are not just some number. God knows where you are, and God knows who you are. But God also knows where you've been. Back to verse 8. The angel said to her, Hagar, Sarai's servant, where have you come from and where are you going? Here's how Hagar responded. She says, I'm running away from my mistress Sarah. It's like, hey, God is asking Hagar, like, so Hagar, what's your plan? What are you going to do? And it's a strange question because God already knows the answer to this, right? But I think what God is doing here is God wants her to say this out loud. God wants her to share what has happened to her. And Hagar does. She says, I'm running because of Sarah. I'm running because I've been mistreated. I'm running because I have been abused. I'm running because my back is up against the wall. And none of this news is shocking to God. God knows all of this. And just like Hagar, God knows what you've experienced too. God knows that you've been mistreated. God knows that you've been abused. God knows the things you've been told not to repeat. God knows the secrets you've held on to for all these years. God knows the things that you have seen, and you're doing everything in your life to unsee those things. God knows what you've been running from. God knows your back is against the wall, and you may think you're forgotten. You may think God doesn't care, but God knows where you've been. And for some of us, when we begin to think about that, it takes us to that question that this mom asked as I was sitting there in her living room, that question of why. Well, if God knew this and God knew this was happening, why? Why didn't God do something about this? Why didn't God jump in? Why didn't God change my my life? Why didn't God just do something about this trauma that I was experiencing? And because we're asking that question, for some, there's a disconnect with God. Like, we don't want to do much with God. We don't really want to believe in God, because how could a God who says that he is loving and cares for people allow this to happen to me? My real answer to you is I don't know. I don't. Maybe a little bit of a better answer is our world is full of sinners, and that includes you and me. And I know that doesn't really help many of us as we try to deal with the trauma that we've experienced in our life. But let me maybe add this to this, and this is kind of what I've learned over my life, is that hurt people hurt people. Maybe you've heard that phrase before. Hurt people hurt people. In my years of ministry and in my years of life, as I've been around people who have experienced trauma at the hands of someone else, so often it's because of their own pain, their own hurt. Many times it's their own trauma, and they've never worked to find help or to find healing, and so they use this hurt that they have deep inside of them to hurt other people. And who are the people they hurt? People who do not deserve it. And so if you're this person who's being hurt by someone who has been hurt themselves, please know that's not coming from God. That's not God ignoring you. That's that individual. It's their sin. It's their pain. It's their hurt. And sometimes it's their own trauma that they pass on to someone else. And again, they've never tried to work on finding help and healing from what they've experienced themselves. And so hurt people hurt people. And let me talk to you, if you're one of those people that hurt other people, stop. You can do it. You can decide to stop. You can decide to find help. You can decide to find healing. You can decide to allow God to lead you through this dark place and those dark spaces in your life. And here's what's so important to understand. God is a God who can forgive, and God is a God who can heal. And I'll be honest with you, it'll take a lot of time. If you're that person that's hurting other people, it's not going to take you a couple of days or a few weeks. It's going to take you more than a few months. This may take you years. But that's the power of professional help through a therapist. That's the power of confession and being able to say, hey, I acknowledge what I did. That's the power of seeking out forgiveness from the people that you have hurt. That's the power of God at work in our lives and to guide us. If you don't break the cycle of trauma, it will continue on in your life as you hurt people. And maybe now's the time to break from that. Back to our story. God asked Hagar to do something that really doesn't make sense. Back to verse 9. It says, the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her authority. It's kind of a weird request by God. God says, hey, I want you to go back to Sarah. And we hear that, and probably for some of us, we're like, well, hold up. Is God condoning this mistreatment and this abuse? Does God want her to go back there and relive what she experienced in the past? Or, and this is what I believe God is doing, God is saying, Hagar, it's time for you to confront your trauma. It's time for you to confront that past. Brennan Manning, in his book, All His Grace, wrote, my experience has shown me that I all too often tend to deny that which lies behind, but as I still believe, that which is denied cannot be healed. Like, we desire healing from the trauma that we've experienced, which means we can't deny our past. We can't deny those experiences. We can't deny that trauma. And we have to learn to confront that trauma to find the healing that we need. I believe this is God again saying, hey, Hagar, it is time to confront your past. Because God knows where you've been, and God wants to help you move forward because God knows where you're going. Look at verse 10. Then he added, I will give you more descendants than you can count. And the angel also said, you are now pregnant and will give birth to a son. You are to name him Ishmael, which means God hears, for the Lord has heard your cries of distress. God tells Hagar, I know where you are. I know who you are. I know where you've been, but I also know where you're going. I know the future. I know what's in front of you. And so God gives her a promise. He says, you're going to have a son. And I want you to name him Ishmael. Now, in that culture, again, for Hagar, having a son would have meant incredible security for her in her life. But God tells her, name him Ishmael, because that means God hears. God's saying, hey, I've heard your cries. I've heard your pain. I've heard your hurt. And I am here to tell you, Hagar, that you are not forgotten. And here's how she responds. Verse 13, thereafter, Hagar used another name to refer to the Lord who had spoken to her. She said, you are the God who sees me. Hagar says, God, you see me, and now I see you, which means I know that you are with me. For you, it's important to understand God sees you, God knows you, God cares for you, God hears you, and now might be the time for you to see God too in the trauma that you've experienced. I mentioned a little bit earlier about my wife, Kara, living in a home with an abusive father for 15 years. And together we decided that years back that we were just going to cut off that relationship with him. And I know some of you are like, well, hold up. Abraham, God told Hagar to go back and be in the midst of that. Sometimes confronting your past doesn't mean being face to face with the person who created that trauma in your life. Kara's been working with a couple of therapists for the past 12 years, and again, we decided to cut off that relationship with her dad because of to protect my wife, Kara. That was important to me, to protect our kids, protect our family, and he passed away at the last fall. But 10 years ago, she had a really great therapist down in North Carolina who said, hey, you're ready to write a letter to your dad. She's like, you don't have to see him face to face, but I think it'd be important for you to write a letter and to send it to your dad. And in that letter, Kara said, hey, Dad, I remember everything. I remember everything that you did to me as a kid and as a teenager. Then she wrote these words at the very end. She wrote, and I forgive you. Kara and I were talking about that this past week and trying to dialogue a little bit about what parts of her story I was allowed to share and the topic of trauma. And she said something to me that I did not know until this past week. She said, hey, Chad, through everything that I faced, even as a child, she said, I never wavered on God. She said, even as a kid, experiencing the things I experienced, I always knew God was present and God was with me. My wife has more faith than I do, I think. And in the 25 plus years that we have been together, I've seen that faith at work. Like there's this connection that she's had with God and that she's understood through everything that she's gone through, everything that she has experienced in her life, that God has always been there for her and God has always had something better for her in her future. But you know what? She continues to work on that trauma. She still sees a counselor on a regular basis. And feel like part of my duty is to be there beside her as she walks down this path. But maybe some of you have been there in your own life. Maybe some of you feel like Hagar and you've experienced trauma, but you understand that God has been with you and you see God at work through this, even though in the midst of it, it may feel like God is somewhere else, but you've seen that and you've relied on God, and God has used that in your life. And maybe your faith has grown stronger as you've worked through that yourself. Wherever we may be, though, with the traumas that we've experienced, sometimes what we are looking for, if we haven't dealt with it, if we haven't sought help or healing, is just these small victories. I love what C.S. Lewis says. He says, good and evil both increase at compound interest. That is why the little decisions you and I make every day are of such infinite importance. The smallest good act today is the capture of a strategic point from which, a few months later, you may be able to go on to victories you never dreamed of. If you've ever experienced trauma in your life and you haven't dealt with it, you know what you need right now? You need some victories. You need to get to the place where you can confront your trauma. You need to get to a place where you find healing from those experiences. You need to get to a place, for some of you, if you're traumatizing other people, you need to get to a place of just stopping what you are doing. But no matter where we may be, like Hagar, like Kara, like some of you, we need to get to a place where we can see God at work. And that can come through these victories. Let me share what I think some of these may be. The first one is acknowledge your trauma. It's so important to acknowledge it. It's time to stop hiding from it or disassociating from it. It's time to acknowledge that it is there and it is a part of who you are, sadly. But acknowledge that. And just acknowledging it for some of us might be the biggest victory like we can have today. The second thing I would say is seek professional help. Look, we talk about counseling a lot here at The Journey. Maybe some of you get sick of it. Back in the fall, we had some people that were visiting, and I talked about counseling like every week. And finally, they were like, hey, we're going to leave because it feels like you do an infomercial for Safe Harbor every week. And I'm like, I'm okay with doing an infomercial for Safe Harbor every week. I don't get any kickbacks from this, by the way, okay? And it's not just Safe Harbor, it's just counseling in general. Especially when we're talking about trauma. Man, that's a deep place. And as I've shared before at the beginning of the series, our staff is not able to walk you down the path you need to go through to find that healing. And so let us help you find that healing. The thing I would tell you is that sometimes people are like, oh man, I really need to do counseling, but I can't afford it. That's why we put money aside every year to make sure that's never an excuse for anybody. And so if you're at this place, you're like, I need to take this step. I need to take this move. I need to find professional help. It's a QR code in front of you. You can click on it. I think about 2 or 3 clicks down, there buttons down. It says counseling help. Let us get you connected to Safe Harbor. You can do it through our app. We actually have a Safe Harbor counselor who is here after our service under the tent. Stop by there, grab some information, ask a quick question, whatever it may be. But do not hesitate to take that step. Man, it is such a huge victory when you begin to be able to share your story and have somebody walk you through it. The last thing I would say is have faith in a God who knows where you are, knows who you are, knows where you've been, and knows where you're going. The purpose of this series has been to get to a place where some of us would begin to raise the white flag and say, I surrender. Here in a little bit, the band's going to lead us in that song again that we've sung a couple of times, that white flag song. And as we think about that we can get to this place where we raise that white flag and we say, hey, God, I surrender. I need help. I need healing. I'm trying to do this on my own. It's not causing anything but problems. I'm traumatizing other people because of my own trauma. I need you to lead me and guide me, and I need faith in you, and I just want to see you, God. And maybe for you, that's the biggest victory you can have today. And through this series we've been through. In fact, let me just add one other piece. Many of you have come to us as a staff and shared some of your stories, and We don't want this just to kind of be the end of this series. We want to kind of keep it going. And so if this series has helped you in any way, we want you to share your story with us. You can send us an email with your stories, STORIES, at thejourneynova.org. Share your story with us. And if we feel like that's something we want to share with other people and you're okay with that, we'll ask you to do that. But just how God has been moving in this series and working in your life. So we know we're not alone in this, right? It's okay to not be okay, and Jesus wants to make you whole.